Afternoon. Welcome to our criminal justice platform webinar on responses to sexual violence. It is exactly 2 o'clock and I think there will still be participants coming in, but I thought we start on time because we only have 1 hour. Before we start, let me mention some technical issues. Your microphones and cameras have been muted and only the speakers are visible and have their microphone on. So please keep it like this so we do not have any sound disturbances. We will have 2 presentations, and after each presentation there will be a bit of space for questions. If you have questions, please type them anytime in the chat function and choose to all panelists and attendees. We will monitor the questions and we will hand them over to the speakers after their presentation, as long as time allows for that, of course. And also we would like to inform you that we will be recording the webinar and that it will be made available on our website. And once the recordings have been placed on the website, you will receive an email about it. You will also receive a link to an evaluation form, and we would very much appreciate your feedback. This is our very first webinar, so it's definitely a learning curve for us. And it can also be helpful for our presenters in their presentations for future, preparation for future presentations. Today's webinar comes in place of a 3-day summer course that was actually planned to take place this week in Barcelona. And of course, we would have preferred to meet you all today in this beautiful city for an active and lively exchange instead of having an online meeting. However, looking at the bright side of things, we have an enormous amount of participants today. At least there were 235 who registered. And of course, there are always less that finally attend, but it will definitely be more than the 60 participants for which we had space in Barcelona, all 3 groups. And if I say 3 groups, it is because the Criminal Justice Platform is a cooperation of 3 European network organizations. So this is our organization of prison practitioners, the European Organization of Prison and Correctional Services, EuroPris. It is CEP, the Confederation of European Probation, and the European Forum for Restorative Justice. The idea of this criminal justice platform is to create a crossover of persons from different professional backgrounds and from different European countries. So the idea is to facilitate the opportunity to discuss and to share among experts that bring different insights to the same topic. And when it became clear that we would unfortunately not be able to organize a live event in Barcelona, we decided to replace this with a series of 3 webinars. So this offers, of course, not the same possibilities as a live meeting, but at least we wanted to give you an impression of the issue that each of our organizations would have addressed in their 3-day course. You can also consider today as a teaser for the actual live summer course on responses to sexual violence, which we will now organize in 2021. Sexual violence and sexual violent offenses have often a long-lasting effect on the victims, as we have seen, for example, in the Me Too movement. And they also stir up strong emotions in the public, and often politicians are responding with calls for harsh punishment. So is the prison the answer to this call? And what about the professionals in prison and probation that are working with these offenders? The double role that the staff is facing to, on the one hand, execute punishment, and on the other hand, to rehabilitate, is especially complicated for this group of offenders. In our workshop, we wanted to explore how a safe environment can be created in prison. We want to look at risk assessment, at intervention programs, interagency cooperation, and on how staff that is working with ex-offenders can best be supervised and assessed. And of course, we can only do that to a limited extent today, but we hope to raise your interest for our summer course in 2021. And before I introduce our first speaker, I just also want to mention shortly that the Penological Council of the Council of Europe is currently working on drafting a recommendation on the assessment, management, and integration back into community of individuals accused or convicted of sexual offenses. So the recommendation is expected to be adopted by the Council of Ministers at the end of this year or at the beginning of 2021. So let me now introduce our first speaker of today, Dr. Nicholas Blackton. Nicholas is an associate professor in forensic psychology at Nottingham Trent University in England. He is also a co-founder and trustee of the Safer Living Foundation, a charity which reintegrates men with sexual convictions into the community. And he has worked and researched within criminal justice and prison settings for over 10 years and has numerous publications on its name. So Nick, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'll just first off do the old share the screen. Okay, so I'm really hoping that everyone can see this as a slideshow and that I'm just sort of a little bit to the side of that. I'm sort of going to be relying on probably you, Kirsten, to let me know if there's any sort of issues in terms of whether I'm coming through or not. This is the first webinar that I've done, getting used to this sort of new way of doing. I'm going to time myself as well. Getting used to this new way of doing things is quite. The new normal is quite interesting. I've never thought I'd be doing a web-based conference in my son's room, but I've tried to treat this as exactly how I would do a normal one. I've even got a suit jacket on, sort of prepared for it. So, as Kirsten said, I'm going to talk a little bit of, it's a bit of a primer really, a brief primer in terms of, I'm going to look at the importance of prison climate in the rehabilitation of men with sexual convictions. I'm going to talk about some of the things that I think are really important for that. And then after that, I think Marianne's going to hone down in more detail and some of the nuance of that, particularly with a focus on the quality of staff and training and support. I suppose really to think about this in terms of context, one of the things that if we think about the decades of research that's gone on, we think about the meta-analyses, the Hansen meta-analyses for treatment of men with sexual convictions. We know an awful lot about treatment targets, dynamic risk factors. We know things that if we target them in interventions, that they will have an impact in terms of recidivism. We know quite a lot about what works and what doesn't work. We probably know more about what doesn't work than we do of what works. But one of the things that's happened is that there's been a significant lack of research in looking at the context and the environment of where that's done. So as Jason Ware said sort of years ago, really, the context in which treatment is provided may actually be quite important to the effectiveness of treatment. So again, it's really important to think about context. And context matters. And so why does context matter? Well, we had a very sort of damning report not so long ago, a Muse meta-analysis done by the Ministry of Justice, which looked at the prison-based sex offender treatment programme in England and Wales and found that not only did it really not have an impact, for some groups it made them sort of slightly worse. It was quite a controversial finding at the time. And it basically showed that prison-based programmes didn't work. And this is coming at a time when there's quite a lot of research which is really focused on this topic, if you like. So a recent paper on intensity of timing of treatment, looking at specialised sex offender treatment in terms of reoffending remains inconsistent, drawing attention to the need to focus more on programme characteristics. So this idea that we know very little about these sort of core aspects and we need to think more widely about things that will affect treatment. On a more positive note, a recent meta-analysis by Teresa Gannon found that treatment can have an impact, but there were several things that sort of moderated that, and one of them being sort of psychological input from staff, as well as other programme variables. The most high-profile meta-analysis is still the most stringent one out there, the sort of go-to if you're interested in sort of meta-analytical papers in terms of recidivism, is the Schmucker and Lozier and Schmucker meta-analysis in terms of the effects of sex offender treatment. And basically they found that in prison-based programs, there wasn't an effect for treatment. So this, again, sort of makes us think much more sort of in sharp focus in terms of thinking about rehabilitative climate. Here's another sort of if we look at treatment setting and all these different sort of papers, we look at the red, which is the prison, we tend to find that it very rarely has an effect. So let's sort of take home message really, particularly when you look at the sort of really stringent meta-analysis like the Schmucker and Lozier ones, is that there's rarely an effect for prison. And interestingly, in the Muse paper that was done on the England and Wales sex offender treatment programs, was that they didn't account for different prison settings. There's different environments. So what this has led myself, colleagues, a lot of other people out there thinking about is we need to think much more widely about the sort of rehabilitative climate and the impact that that can have on rehabilitation. So what do we mean by a rehabilitative climate? So a rehabilitative climate is the ways in which a correctional climate fosters and promotes positive personal change. So how conducive is it to rehabilitation? It will take the sort of core components of what is called a social climate, which is growth, support, atmosphere, and what the Institute of Criminology in Cambridge calls sort of a moral climate, those sort of human flourishing aspects of human decency, fairness, and prisoner staff interactions. But it has another component to it as well, which is about an emphasis on readiness to change, promotion of change, and relationships that help to foster change. So really we can think about rehabilitative climate as a responsivity, an external responsivity factor that we don't consider as much as we should do. This is also coming at a sort of pivotal time really, where we're starting to think differently about rehabilitation. When I started working in prisons back in 2005, 2006, if you wanted to be rehabilitated, you went to a certain wing, and that's where rehabilitation happened. It happened in it's very side, it happened in a particular place. This is where rehabilitation happens. This idea that people got fixed in programs in particular points around the prison. There's much, and this is a very siloed way of thinking, there's much more thought now in terms of that is not alone. Programs in and of itself isn't enough. It could never be enough. It's not a panacea to all sort of problems that an individual have. It is one component of it, and there needs to be a much more joined up approach. So this is this paradigm shift, moving away from this idea that programs fix individuals, to actually, on the one hand, getting people much more invested in programs, so owning your own rehabilitation, taking a stake in it, and moving away from just program stuff to more lives sort of stuff. So people thinking about, what do people want out of life? What does a good life look like for them? And this is mirrored by one of my sort of favorite desistant sort of quotes out there, if you like. The desistant paradigm suggests that we might be better off if we allowed offenders to guide us, listen to what they think might best fit their individuals out of crime, rather than to continue to insist that our solutions are their salvation. I think that's a really, really important point, and we're starting to see that sort of shift. So why should we account for prison climate in program design? Why should we even give it any sort of thought? There's a growing body of research out there which suggests that anti-therapeutic environments have a negative effect on treatment readiness and program outcome. There's a whole other sort of strand of literature which looks at it's not negative environments aren't just bad for the prisoners, the individuals who reside in there, it's also bad for the staff. So it's very difficult to think, if you're doing programs in a really hostile anti-therapeutic environment, there's going to be able to sustain the gains that are made in treatment. It's just not possible. So positive changes in different aspects of prison are related to significant pro-social changes in dynamic risk. So the more positively experienced the climate is, we see greater significant changes in dynamic risk. higher scores in prison climate related to readiness to change. That's something that I've found as well, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So there's a considerable amount of meta-analytical data out there as well about treatment motivation, and treatment motivation tends to be one of the biggest predictors of treatment attrition, which in turn is one of the greatest predictors of recidivism. So some of this is about thinking about we need a climate of a prison which fosters wider treatment goals, moving away from this sort of siloed thinking. So here's some of the studies that have, we look at sort of further evidence for the positive effects of climate. So attitudes towards offending, dropping out of treatment. There's a relationship between prison climate and dropping out of offending, dropping out of programs. Mental health issues during treatment, they spike when the environment is more punitive, is more hostile, is not supportive of treatment. Treatment motivation, or the relationship we were just talking about just earlier. And higher ratings of group cohesion and safety are associated with less institutional aggression. So actually feeling safe in the environment actually stop the sort of acting out as well. So this all sort of points to a need to foster better rehabilitative environments. And this is what, so how do we go about that? It's really easy for me to sort of say this, but how do we go about that? And that's sort of things that I'd have talked about much more detail in the workshop that we'd have done, but I'll try and tease out some of that, and Marianne will pick up some of this as well. So I'll talk very briefly about some of the research that I've been involved with and how that might be important for some aspects of practice. So exploring prison climate. So what I wanted to really was look at, you know, what does a good prison climate look like, and how do men with sexual convictions experience imprisonment. So we've done this in 4 prisons now, but the 3 I'm going to focus on are 3 prisons specifically in England and Wales that actually only house men with sexual convictions. And I want to try and make the argument as well that actually housing men together with sexual convictions, why that is a really good idea. And how that can actually foster some of the treatment gains as well. So there was 3 types of prison, as you can see in the prison aspects here. There's a rehab prison, which is a treatment-focused prison. There was a re-rolled prison, which basically housed all violent offenders, then re-rolled, which basically meant all those went out and then went in men with sexual convictions. And a third prison, which wasn't treatment focused, but focused on something slightly different, which was an active citizen approach. Active citizenship is all about sort of basically doing good for the community. It's about getting men invested in the environment, invested in, and to sort of create a community within prison. I'll talk very briefly about the quantitative phase and the qualitative phase. I don't really have time for this. It's only sort of a 20-minute presentation. The qualitative phase, we did over 100 interviews, including with the re-roll prison, we did a longitudinal study, so before and after that. And then we also interviewed them at these different prisons to get a sense of what is it like to live in that environment and what does this environment mean for them in terms of focusing on their own rehabilitation. I'll talk very briefly about the measures, only because I mentioned them in a slide or 2. The Essences is a well-known measure of therapeutic climate. There's 3 aspects to it. Therapeutic hold, which is basically prisoner staff relationships, so also called hold and support. Prisoner cohesion, which is basically prisoner-prisoner relationships. And experience safety, how safe do people feel in their environment. There was a rehabilitative climate questionnaire, basically a measure of external validation with the Essences. An attitudes measure in terms of people's attitudes towards men with sexual convictions. A measure of implicit theories of offending behaviour is basically a measure of whether they believe they can change. So I can change many things about my life, but I can't change my offending behaviour. There's 2 aspects of that, a self version, an I version, and an other version. People can. People can change many things about their life, but they can't change their own offending behaviour. A readiness measure and a really well-validated well-being measure. And I'll quickly sort of talk about this. I've got papers on this. If people are interested in some of this research or a wider discussion, I'm very happy to speak to people, very happy to sort of communicate with people by email and send out all this stuff. The one thing I really want to showcase really is in the 2 sort of more rehabilitative environments were the scores on experience safety. They were significantly different from the re-roll prison. The experience safety are among the highest quintile of scores, so really really high experience safety. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute and say why that's actually quite important for the rehabilitative process. Then I wanted to see, well, what is it that sort of predicted a good rehabilitative outcome? What was important for it? When we took all these things together, all these measures that I've mentioned before, what was it that actually sort of bore fruit, really? What was really important? The biggest predictor was prisoner-staff relationships. These matter, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Prisoner-prisoner relationships, readiness for treatment, and also readiness for change. And I wanted to see what readiness to change, or what predicted readiness to change. Again, prisoner-staff relationships came out strongly. Rehabilitative culture, that the environment part of that came out really, really strongly. So this was important for the treatment and change aspect. All of this highly, highly relational. When we talked to the men about what was it like sort of residing in these prisons, we've got things like, it was like experiencing a different world. It doesn't matter what you've done here, you're accepted. This place gives you headspace. This is completely different to what I've experienced before. These sorts of things that the men were saying about these prison environments. And the important aspect about this feeling safe, which goes back to this point of experience safety further up, which is actually experience safety allowed people to have the headspace to think, okay, where am I? Where do I want to go? And discover that change is not only possible, but also desirable by feeling at ease in the prison. As you know, with many men who have sexual convictions in prison, it's quite a hostile place, and actually getting them to experience safety is quite a difficult thing. But what was really important for facilitating the change process was the prisoner and staff relationships. And people talked about this in terms of meaningful relationships. So in the prison with an active citizenship focus, it was the prison officer on my wing. He had that like, wow, it was amazing, because she said, you know what, I respect you more. And having that feedback, I can't put a price on it. So this was a prison officer who recognized that they'd gone through treatment and was validating that. And they couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe that a prison officer said, wow, it's amazing that you've done that. Isn't that amazing? Look at the changes that you've made. When you come onto the wing, they're helping you. And I was just sat down at one of the tables, and the officer came and sat the other side and said, how you doing, mister? Everything all right? And I was just blown away. So these little things of just being like, someone noticed it. Someone's actually noticed me. Someone's noticed that I'm not okay, and they've sat opposite me like a human being and asked, are you all right? And these things have such a magnified effect in prison settings. So what makes them positive when people are talking about positive relationships? And this person was saying the honesty that comes from the courses, that comes from the talking that we do, the sharing, and feeling that someone will care, not like, oh, he's a waste of time. So there's a real massive thing about what made these things meaningful was the reciprocal aspects of it, that actually the change that people had made was either being highlighted or validated by other prison staff, that they were valued, and being valued helped to sort of cement the change process. This process of positive feedback and validation is known in the statistics literature as the Pygmalion effect. High outcome equals high expectation. And this was, again, there's the sort of thing that really mattered to them. So this is the sort of thing that we think about what's important. Yes, it's prisoner staff relationships, but what do those relationships look like? And some of it is about, on the one hand, caring, being genuine, being invested in that individual. And these relationships are really important for prisoner, well-being. And they are important for the desistance process in terms of triggering, enabling, sustaining change. Because if there's one thing we know about change, is that change is hard, particularly for our guys, can be really difficult. And a lot of our guys may not have trusting relationships, or have never really experienced that, or have experienced quite a lot of rejecting relationships. And so to have these wider relationships, validate them, was pivotally important. And relationships matter. If there's one thing we know about psychology, is that we're very good at coming up with three-letter therapies, CBT, DBT, CFT. In each one of those, there's always an ABC model. We're very good at putting sort of letters together. But when you reduce it down, a lot of the times, what it comes down to is the nature and quality of that relationship with the therapist, the relationship between other peoples, and that change happens by and through other people and having those relationships. Another real quick aspect, because I want to talk about, because I am running out of time. I can't see any sort of comments down my side, but I'm pretty sure I'll be getting a sort of, you've got like 2 minutes left in a second. So I just wanted to, so at this moment in time, we've talked a bit about sort of programs, we've talked about relationships, we've talked about safety, we've talked about some of these aspects. But another aspect that is really important, one of the key criticisms of actually the last programs, particularly in England and Wales, was, well, they were too cognitive. It was a lot of people talking about change, but not a lot of doing change. And if there's one thing that I would advocate, and certainly in sort of the research that I'm involved in, sort of this comes out really strongly, is that actually we've got to give people the latitude to do identity change, not just talk about it. And one of the ways that we can facilitate that is through things like peer support or having active citizenship roles within prison. These help as well with relationships between prisoner and staff, because there's much more open communication, and it helps with the prisoner and prisoner aspect as well, because it's much more centered around reciprocity, learning from shared experience and helping each other out. So this principle we've termed doing good, being good. I'm pretty sure that probably someone else has said it somewhere, but until someone highlights that to me, I will continue to take some sort of credit for it. So this idea that peer support is that, you know, in the programs and the other stuff, we can sort of talk about change, this reciprocal aspects, but this allows people to engage in it, to enact it. One of these extracts from one of our guys in this said, if you're out through your life causing destruction and distress to people and yourself, you quickly fill your bank up with negative ways of thinking and negative thoughts. It's like a big tub of dirty water. And then you get a positive drip, and eventually more drips. The water gets less murky, overflows, and then it's just nice and clean. That's what happens, basically, learning to accept that positive. And the listener scheme was a big, big drip. So this was about being involved in good things, helped to enact good selves, which helped with other aspects of the sort of rehabilitative process. So there's real benefits in this sort of mutual reciprocity in terms of enabling prisoners to benefit opportunities in self-change. And there's a whole suite of literature out there called the Wounded Healer Narrative. And the ability to help contribute a sense of purpose, gaining a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives. There's a really good paper by LaBelle, and he concludes that helping others to have adaptive consequences for prisoner and ex-prisoners. And on these grounds alone, really, an argument can be made for increasing the opportunities to engage in roles characterised by reciprocal helping. So how can I draw this all together? Well, rehabilitative climate is a responsivity issue that we need to be much more responsive to. Giving people the latitude to develop variable identities is important. Getting people to enact those is probably even more important. But we also need to make sure that there is joined up working within the prisons, that there isn't this sort of siloed thing, that prisoner and staff relationships are constructive, are meaningful, and are invested in the positive change that the individual wants to make in their lives. So taking rehabilitative climate more seriously will help to maintain and sustain treatment gains. I've got quite a few sort of places, a sort of shameless plug slide. I've got quite a few papers on this, and we also took out a book on this very recently. If you want any of these chapters, papers, do give me a shout. I'm more than happy to share any and all things. I think that's me done. I'll stop sharing. Is that okay? I'm okay for time?
Perfect, Nicholas. You did very well. I know that you were worried about having too much to talk for the 25 minutes. I took quite a bit out. You talked very fast, but I think it was very good to follow, especially also looking at your slides. We haven't got any questions in for now. But I think maybe participants also need to digest a bit all the information they received now. I thought it was highly interesting to see. I mean, we get this feedback in many other areas as well about the importance of prisoner-staff relationships, and how very important it also is for this group, next to having a safe environment in the prison. So to create some space for thinking and change, and also for taking this very individual approach rather than a group approach. I think that was, it's very interesting to hear. What maybe just one short question from my side before we move on to Marianne. What do you think is the biggest challenge for staff also to actually engage in this trusted relationship, in this also simple human friendly relationship, you could say, with a group of offenders that sometimes has offenses that also offend staff in a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes out massively in the staff angle of the research that we've done as well, and that for some people it's harder to create or sustain these sort of really meaningful relationships with people because of the things that people have done. You know, it's not uncommon to hear people say things like, I used to get on fine with the violent guys, but I really struggle with this client group. So some of that I think is a training need, which is probably something that Marianne will talk about. One of the things that was rolled out a little bit in England and Wales was the 5-minute intervention. And some of this is just about thinking about just normal social interaction. I mean, a lot of the times I think the training sets people up to be quite punitive at times, and that actually one of the things that are really important for change is just the little things. People are all the things that really strike out with the guys when we ask them is just the little things. You know, this person cared. You know, I asked about this and they did that, and the just that sort of noticing that the example of being someone sat opposite. It's like these have magnified effects. So some of it is about, you know, how would people like to be treated? You know, and there's this sort of misconception as well that I think that people think that this client group is just out to manipulate. That if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile, and that actually these are quite a manipulative group, and actually we need to be on our guard. And actually, yes, there are elements that are like that, as there are elements like that out there in real life who are there. That's just it. But I think some of it is about we need to move away from this sort of view that this group is just manipulative and dangerous. And I think with that helps people to sort of cultivate more open relationships.
Okay. Well, now the questions are coming in, Nicholas. The first one is about the role of the management in facilitating a rehabilitation culture. Could you say something about it?
Yeah, it's pivotally important. In some respects, it's probably the most important aspect. I always sort of liken this sometimes to management of a football team. You have to have a really good sort of person manager at the top who has a vision, who has an approach, and is able to communicate that to their staff. And it goes from there, it stems from the top all the way down. So it's so crucially important to have the management. And also I think there needs to be much more psychological representation in management as well, in terms of having them involved in some of the more senior sort of decision makers. That sometimes I think the psychology staff can be sometimes a little bit excluded too. But that helps with the sort of siloed working. So it has to come from the top. The role of managing is crucially important.
Okay. Another question is about the spiritual and religious healing in prison and how this could lift up relationships and rehabilitation.
Yeah, it's something I think is really important. I have a paper on this that I published not so long ago on how religion can offer frameworks for forgiveness, particularly for this client group, and actually how being forgiven by a sort of higher power, you know, can be sort of quite a powerful thing for this client group, and actually how religious healing can really help with rehabilitation by giving people almost like a linchpin, something to invest in. But also there's a lot of aspects of religion, particularly in prisons, that are quite almost give you, again, meaning and purpose. You know, going to chapel, or praying, those sorts of things, the things that people can enact, can do. So people can do spirituality as well as sort of partaking on it in a sort of in that sort of spiritual form. So I think there's two aspects of it, and I think both of which can help people again make sense in prison. I think it's an untapped resource as well. And again, there's this sort of part of this where people are quite skeptical of it, that, you know, religious individuals who come into prison are again easily manipulated. And I don't think it doesn't quite work out like that. And actually, there's a real strong resource for this, for men, with particularly for our client group. I could talk about that a lot more, but I'm really conscious of time.
Yes, I think also there are more questions here. I will keep them until the end. So when we still have time, we come back to them. And otherwise, maybe you can also respond later on in writing those questions. Let me now introduce our next speaker, Marianne Fuglesvedt. Marianne is a specialist in clinical sexology and psychotherapy. And for the past 7 years, she has been working as R&R consultant in the directorate of the Danish Prison and Probation Service. Her study field and previous work experience are mainly connected to psychological and psychiatric treatment of psychiatric patients and treatment of sex offenders, including designing motivational program for sexual offenders in prison setting. And also since March 2019, she is the scientific expert to the Council of Penological Cooperation, working on the recommendation that I mentioned before. Marianne, I give the floor to you now.
Thank you. I will see if I can manage this. So, can you see it?
Yes.
Good, fine.
Very good.
Så, skal vi se. Jesper, hvordan kan du flytte sig? Okay. So, I needed a little help here. I am going to focus on some of the challenges that are in this work, staff in prisons and in probation too, because as Nicholas said, the relationship between the person who is convicted and the staff is very important for a positive process towards desistance. And so I'm going to look at some of the difficulties actually in the alliance between the persons and the staff, and look into some of the explanations the convicted give of their offense. And how do these explanations affect staff? And I will argue that it is very important that staff who work with this group are having continuous achievement of knowledge, training, supervision and support, not to harden or get burnt out or get compassion fatigue in this work. And at the end I will look at some approaches that could be effective in rehabilitative work. So some authors like Marshall, Fernandez and Mann have said that treatment success with individuals convicted of a sexual offense probably stands or falls on the quality of the staff delivering it more than any other variable. And I think this connects very good to Nick's presentation, where he explained how important the relationship is, and the staff's ability to connect to and to support these persons. So I will look into some of the challenges, because at the same time, this work can be quite critical. And several surveys show that the staff who work with convicted persons who have done sexual offenses can be negatively affected by their work. So I will look into how does the work with this group affect the professionals, the staff, and how can the working alliance between staff and the individuals be affected negatively, and what can we do? So some critical factors can be that when we are talking about with the persons about the offense they're convicted for, we are confronted with transgressive behavior and traumatic events that can be very difficult to listen to and to comprehend. Often the explanations given for the offenses are dissonant. It is hard to find out what is right, what is wrong here. Can I trust this explanation? It doesn't sound right. Another critical factor is that many are disclaiming responsibility for the offense, which I will look into shortly. And often staff thinks that there is no motivation for change here, because when the person doesn't take any responsibility for what he is convicted for, how can I support his motivation? Here in Denmark, in one of our prisons, Herstedvester prison, Jarl Simonsen recently made a survey where he looked into 211 pre-treatment interviews with individuals convicted of a sexual offense. And he looked at themes and trends that can be identified in crime explanations of inmates convicted of a sexual offense. 48% of these 211 persons refused the offense, denied they had anything to do with it, which is typical for this group, that a very large amount deny. And I will look into the reasons for that too. So these are some of the reasons given. Often it's the victim's fault. Victim traits are presented as an underlying premise by presenting accusation that the child's fantasy and sexual behavior is enough to be sentenced for a sexual offense. When it has happened to me, it can happen to everybody. So here the fault is put on the child, and explained as a very strong sexual behavior. Another explanation is because of circumstances. I guess she reported me because her family would get furious if they knew she had voluntarily had sex with me outside marriage. So here again, no responsibility for what has happened. It are the circumstances that are the explanation. Or because of social changes. I have fooled her, but it was not to get sex. Rather, it was a revenge because she cheated on me while we were dating. So it's her own fault. Or because of structural factors. I have difficulties setting borders for children. I want to listen to them and protect them, but I get too close to them. I was refused sexuological treatment, however, which made me frustrated and I felt rejected. So here, the reason for the offense is put on structural factors. And amongst people who admit the offense, we often see explanations that are connected to a diagnosis or other things like alcohol abuse, for example. I started viewing animated child pornography, but it exceeded to a dependency on all kinds of material of children. I had fantasies of girls which really frightened me and I am ashamed of. So here responsibility is taken. It is the person admits the offense, but is explained by a diagnosis or a fault, as like psychological or physiological distortion or fault. So, in summary, Simonsen says that all interviewed explain being aware of what is right and wrong, both amongst confessors and refusers. Among refusers, focus is often on the victim's fault and credibility. So, what is typical here is that explanations tend to reduce personal responsibility through the recognition and the acceptance of stigma as sexually deviant. So, and this is interesting because usually when we do risk assessment, if people deny or minimize the offense, we often see it as a risk factor, as pro-criminal attitude and thinking. But here we can take another stance. Professionals' reactions are often, as I said, that these kind of explanations are an expression of a personality disorder or cognitive distortions, something within the person. But if we take another perspective, different authors have put emphasize on that if we seek to desist from sexual offending and reintegrate into society, it is important to protect the pro-social identity. So these explanations that put the reason for the offense on external factors helps the person stay pro-social, or it protects their pro-social identity. So Paternoster's, in desistance research, Paternoster says that the explanation given is a core element in desistance. And the explanation of that I'm not yet, that I'm not longer the same person as the one who committed the crimes, or something outside me, something external factors made me do it. So, if we want to support desistance, it is important that staff have certain skills in rehabilitative work. As Nicholas said, it is so important that we start recognizing that the individual is an expert on himself, and we have to respect the person's desistance process. And it is so in this process, it is so important that we recognize the person's explanations of what has happened and why did I do it. And perhaps it is not the truth from all angles, but it is a way to survive and to protect a pro-social identity. So active listening and that we do not draw conclusions on pattern recognition is very important here. Because many of us are trained in drawing conclusions on pattern recognition in work with clients. Here, we have to take that away and we have to be open and listen and adjust to the individual's responsivity. Farmer argued that whether true or not, participants utilize these situational explanations as a form of stigma management to allow them to develop a positive identity as a non-offender. Very important, because the change has to come from within. We cannot put change on anybody. It has to come from within. So is there potential for desistance? Both Simonsen's and Farmer's studies show that both deniers and admitters explain the sexual offenses as not representative for their personal values and moral. All interviewed dissociate from the offense they are convicted of. and hereby express pro-social identity and values, which is a potential for desistance process. Several authors have shown that denial is not a risk factor, it's a responsivity factor. So, staff support, which is the topic of my presentation. Because this group of offenders are not typical, or they are not alike all other groups in prisons, it is very important that staff all the time continuously achieve knowledge about evidence base for static and dynamic risk factors, causes for denial and neutralizations, and examine their attitudes towards the individual and the offensive behavior. Because, as I explained, often when we hear these explanations, we can feel angry. We feel anger, and and the alliance with the person can be really challenged, because it is so difficult for us to accept the explanations they give, because sometimes they are difficult to comprehend. So all the time, the staff have to look at their attitudes and be supervised in the work, awareness of their emotional reactions to the work, and all the time develop new skills in the work, whether it is risk assessment, motivational work, program work, and it's for all staff, kinds of staff, prison officers, social workers, psychologists, all who are engaged in rehabilitative work. So effective approaches are described as mutual respect and trust. Denial and neutralizations are responsivity challenges, not risk factors. And do not confront denial or neutralization, but enhanced responsibility should be the aim, perhaps obtained in other ways. If you, for example, interventions that are strength-based group programs, or peer support work, where the pro-social skills training in the daily life in prison and in interventions is important. So Perrin says, if the reduction of stigma and self-loathing is associated with reduced recidivism, then it would seem that this is an idea worth pursuing. And here's my literature. Yeah, that was my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Marianne. We haven't had any questions, particularly to you, In. There was a question before on what if offenders continue to deny the offending, and Niklas already responded in writing, and I think you also responded quite extensively in your presentation about that, so we don't need to talk about that further. Maybe one other question that came in before, that was about how extensive should the network be for implementing the ideas presented outside of the prison. The question was asked, Niklas, when you were presenting. You would need to unmute your microphone before starting to respond, please.
Yes, I think I've just replied through the message on that one. I think it's a really important question about wider network, because I think we can do really good work in prison if we sort of think about what's important about a rehabilitative climate, which is the sort of intervention aspects, but also doing good things and having those really important, you know, prisoner staff meaningful relationships and peer support. the work I've done with Christian parents, which is Mariam just mentioned, really important stuff. But then when people get out, the harsh reality is there's a lot of peer support roles that men can do in prison, but they are not allowed to do in the community. Samaritans is a really good example of that. People can be listeners and Samaritans within prisoners. So Samaritans are a peer support group for suicide and self-harm, and people get a lot of meaning from those roles, but they can't do those in the community. So one of the things that we need to do much more, particularly people who work in prison, particularly senior management, again, it's back to that management sort of question, is working much more extensively with wider social groups in order to sustain those things that are gained within prison.
Okay, thank you. Anything you want to add, Mariana? Or no? We have another question in about the essential skills required for rehabilitation skills in prison. I think we talk about stuff here. It would be for you, Mariana.
Yeah. Well, I think listening, active listening skills, and start seeing us as not a person who should push the other person into change, but instead making a cooperation, skills in cooperation, in good alliances, good cooperation, listening actively, and trying to understand the other person's perspective. And using motivational interviewing is very important, where you're listening to what are the wishes for change expressed in the person's explanations.
Yes.
I think it's most important.
Nick, do you want to add to that?
You know, I was just going to say exactly the same thing. I think one of the most important things tend to be sort of soft skills, really, the sort of active listening, those aspects of reciprocity as well, in terms of the valuing of the other individual, and how. So there's an intervention, like I mentioned earlier on, the 5-minute intervention, which we ran in England and Wales for a bit, and that was about teaching sort of prison officers soft skills. And what we found when we evaluated that was not only did it have an impact in terms of the prisoner and the prison officer, but it had a wider effect as well, because what it did was it invested a relationship between the prisoner and the member of staff. And this had a magnified effect, because then it was sort of like if there was a sort of thing on the wing and someone was saying, oh, that prison officer, what a complete, whatever. The other person who had this relationship with the officer was saying things like, well, actually, he's if you approach him like this, he's actually really good and he's really helped me out a lot, actually. And so it was almost mediating other sort of conflicts that came up. So again, it came to sort of soft skills stuff, the active listening. But also turning everyday conversations into sort of rehabilitative conversations, really, which is exactly the sort of thing that Mariam was talking about. It has not only an impact for that sort of dyad, but a wider impact as well on the wings, where these things are not done inconsistently, but are done consistently. And that's another sort of key aspect of this, that this has to be done consistently.
Which sounds in a way easy, active listening, being open, don't judge, but it is very, very hard. And actually I'm wondering also, when I listen to that, how much can be achieved with staff training, and how much shouldn't be taken into consideration when hiring staff, actually, to assess that you have the right qualities of persons who can actually engage into such processes of like motivational interviewing. Yeah.
And sometimes as well, we are hampered by the environment. I was at a local prison yesterday for the first time in 3 or 4 months because they've been locked down. And you just think about how difficult it is to cultivate real sort of meaningful relationships at the minute, when people continue to talk about England and Wales, but most of our prisoners are locked up 23 hours a day at the minute. That makes it very, very difficult to do it. So I'm aware that some of the things that we're talking about may seem a sort of little bit sort of best case scenario. I think when things are working well and you can really work on these, but at the minute, these are even more difficult to do. And perhaps actually more important now than ever to really have those sort of consistencies in the sort of approaches that you have with people, because there's a lot of anxiety out there in the guys at the minute.
Mm-hmm. I think Marianne, you wanted to also add to that.
Yes, I just want to say that pro-social modeling, that aspect of staff is we have to emphasize that more. I think Nick came with some very good examples on that. That when you talk to somebody in a polite way, or when you show a way of a pro-social way of behavior, when you show trust to another person, that is what you get back again to. So yeah, it does not have to be that complicated.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for your very interesting presentations. I'm afraid we have used up our time. So, like Nick and Marianne said, if you have further questions or would like to receive some materials, they are happy to do that. Just let us know. So thank you also for your participation and the questions on this very important and sensitive topic. And I very much hoped we have raised your interest. And if we did, you can mark your calendars already for next year's summer course. Both Nick and Marianne will be the trainers in our group, and the summer course will take place from 6 to 9 July 2021. And keep in mind that each of the group will only be able to hold about 20 participants. So you might need to register early if you would like to participate. And you can follow the planning of the next summer course and the opening of the registrations in our newsletter and on our website. Tomorrow and Thursday, CEP and the European Forum will have their webinars taking place. And for those that are joining these other webinars, I wish you very interesting sessions. And I wish my colleagues from the platform good luck with their events. And finally, I would like to remind you to submit your feedback of the webinar in the evaluation form. So I hope to see some of you next year. And for now, I wish you a nice afternoon and thank you again for joining.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.